So now we are listening to Dag Spicer. When Dag accepted to give a talk here at TUG 2022, I've been really delighted. Dag is a senior curator of the Computer History Museum in Mountain View in California. And it happens that I had the luck to visit this museum and I really enjoyed it. Dag is both an electrical engineer and an historian of science and technology. And I'm really eager to listen to him. So Dag, the mic is yours.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I really appreciate that. Can everybody hear me okay? Just put your hand up or something. Yeah?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, great. Thank you. I just want to check. So welcome to the tour of the Computer History Museum. We've got 45 minutes, so it's going to be a fairly brisk tour. The first thing I wanted to mention is just, whoops, I'd like to dedicate this presentation to Dave Walden, who is a good colleague of mine at the IEEE Annals of the History of Computing, and I know he played a big role with the tech user group as well. So just wanted to remember him. The brief early history of the museum is that it had started with Ken Olsen, who was an electrical engineer from MIT in the mid-1950s, forming with his brother a company called Digital Equipment Corporation, which probably a lot of you have heard about. And that was based in a suburb of Boston known as Marlborough. And then essentially what he did is they heard of a large computer called the MIT Whirlwind computer, which was the first large-scale electronic real-time computer ever made. And it was done at MIT in the early 1950s. And that was headed towards the dump. And so Ken Olsen and Gordon Bell, his VP of engineering, turned the truck around and said, hey, we got to save this. This is, one of the key historical chapters in the history of computing. And to think at the time of the history of computing, when the computing itself as a field is just starting, is really quite visionary. Not many people think about preserving their own history as it's being made. So the first museum was at Digital Equipment Corporation in one of their headquarter office buildings at Marlborough in '79. In '84, we moved to a proper building down in Boston on Museum Wharf, which is in the middle of downtown Boston. It's a lovely place. There's lots of restaurants and fun things for tourists to do there. And we were quite successful there. Now, what happened in '96 is that the historical collection, which we had been slowly accumulating over the years, was really not seen much in Boston, which had sort of evolved into a children's museum. So we moved the historical collection out to Mountain View, in fact, to Moffett Field, excuse me, in '96. And remember, at the time, this is about 12 to 1,300 canonical rare objects in the history of computing, everything from 17th century Napier's bones to an Apollo guidance computer, that is the computer that went to the moon, and just on and on, sort of a buffet of nonstop greatest hits in the history of computing. And that would really reflects upon Gordon and his wife Gwen, who collected actively throughout this period. So anyway, in 2002, we got our real building, which is actually the former world marketing headquarters of Silicon Graphics. And if you've ever been there, you'll know it's quite a large, beautiful building. It's 120,000 square feet. So that's 1,200 square meters. And because at this stage, remember I said we started with 12 or 1,300 objects. By the time 2007 rolls around, that's about 10 or 15 years after I started. I got there in '96. We now have upwards of 100,000 objects. So the museum now has the world's largest collection of historical computing objects. In 2008, we got a really cool object on temporary loan. This was a Babbage difference engine, of which there are only two in the world. One is at the Science Museum in London, and the other was this one at the Computer History Museum. It was built especially for Nathan Myhrvold, the former CTO of Microsoft, who personally paid to have one made. They're about $1.5 million each. And Nathan very kindly left it at the museum so it can be demonstrated for about 8 years. I'm just going to move on now and to some highlights. This you might recognize is the last scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark when they finally put away the, the artifacts. Our warehouse doesn't quite just go off into infinity like that, but it is pretty impressive, and it's climate controlled, and everything is barcoded and organized, and we actually have robots that go and fetch different objects as they're required. So it's all highly automated, and so we have good intellectual control over the objects in our collection. So I'm going to take a quick step through our main exhibit, which is called Revolution: The First 2,000 Years of Computing History. It's made up of 17 galleries, and we're not going to stop at all 17. We're just going to take a quick walk through, about a dozen of them or so. And so we start with the abacus, and the timeline, as we call it, this exhibit, the Revolution exhibit, goes chronologically through time. So we start at the beginning of computation or calculation, which we look at the early forms of the abacus. The very earliest forms are really just lines in the sand with pebbles, put in between the lines. That was believed to be the very earliest abacus, and not even what later became called a counting frame. And a counting frame is, literally a little square with rods that go up and down and little beads that you can move up and down. The abacus has been seen across multiple cultures throughout Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Russia, and Eastern Europe. So it's spread wide over the last, it's been in use continuously for about 2,000 years. So it's quite an impressive technology from that point of view. And that's part of the reason why we named our exhibit Revolution: The First 2,000 Years of Computer History. The other reason we did that is because of this object, the Antikythera Mechanism, which was a rust-encrusted wheel of what later turned out to be bronze and brass, found by Greek sponge divers in 1901 near a tiny island in the Greek Aegean known as Antikythera. There's two islands, one is called Kythera and then there's Antikythera. The Antikythera shipwreck, which is what it turned out to be, where this object, which you can see at the bottom there, is just kind of a circular object there. That turned out to be a remarkable, this is what it looks like if you just take it apart. There's only one of these known to exist. It's in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And this is what was believed the Antikythera mechanism did. So all these gears that you see here were actually stuffed into a box with a nice faceplate on it. It's a reconstruction, obviously. And you see all the gears in the middle here. These have been slowly reconstructed using very advanced computed tomography techniques and X-ray machines to calculate the number of gears to essentially page through the different layers of the gears, which are all fused together because they've been, sitting at the bottom of the ocean for 100 years. They're all stuck together and fused with they're all rusted together. So they've managed to create this exploded diagram. And essentially what you do is on the right, you dial in the current location of the sun and the stars, and it lets you predict when the next eclipse will be, and any time in the next, several years, the position of the planets for years ahead in the future. So it's actually a sophisticated astronomical calculator. And this is in the 2nd century BC, which is really what is mind-blowing about this thing that I have to point out, because if you look at the mechanisms here, all the gears and the wheels and stuff in the West, or actually anywhere on Earth in human civilization, no one knew how to do this until essentially the early Middle Ages, when in the clockmaking and clockmaking tradition, when people started building clocks. So this is, almost like I like to joke and call it an alien artifact, because no one can figure out how a machine of this complexity could possibly have been built in the 2nd century. We just don't know how they could have done it, and we still don't. So that is a really cool object. And again, it fits in the history of computing, because all of these patterns, all of these gears and wheels and so on actually encode, as we found out with a lot of study, centuries of observations by Babylonian and Egyptian astronomers who wrote down their observations in tables. And then those were, they discovered that actually there are certain cycles that the motions of the planets repeat. They're very strange cycles, like 29-year cycles, 37-year cycles, really weird. So the wheels essentially replicate those Babylonian and Egyptian observations in brass, and create a display on the front, kind of a user interface on the right-hand side there that you can see, that lets you dial in the current time and day, and using the bottom dial because you turn, as you turn the top dial, the bottom dial moves. So it will tell you, where the moon will be 3 weeks from now, for example. So that's the Antikythera mechanism. And it is, I think, one of the most, we don't have it in the museum. Of course, it's as I mentioned, in the Archaeological Museum in Athens, but it is, to my mind, just as a historian of technology, absolutely mind-blowing, like finding, digging at Oldavi Gorge in Africa and finding a transistor radio on the same layer as a 2 million-year-old skeleton or something. Not quite that bad, but it's very odd, and we still haven't figured out how they made it. So I'll just leave that with you. So the history of computing, as we understand it, that is more modern, to say 20th century and onwards, really begins with a problem that had to be solved in the 1890s, and that was the United States Census. The US Constitution says that a census of the population, a count of the population, must occur once every 10 years. And that's done for many reasons. All sorts of government programs depend on that, and voting and redistricting of voting districts depends on that too. So it's a very fundamental process in American democracy to get an accurate census. The problem is that the 1880 census had just been finished in about 1889. So it took them almost the full 10 years to do a census now. And because there were so many people immigrating to the United States. And so a German-American engineer came up with a solution, which is the little wooden unit you see in front of you, which is actually, I'll just back up a bit. Can't really see what he did essentially is take written census answers and then encode them into a punch card. Now, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of a punch card here. Wanted to show you one because then it would make so much sense. But the punch card is essentially the way that computers were interacted with for most of the 20th century, in fact. And it's a cardboard, piece of cardboard with a bunch of holes in it, which encode information. And essentially, you'll see all those dials on the Hollerith machine there, as it's called. As you read each one of those cards, if there was a hole in the card, the corresponding counter would move over one position. So at the end of the day, you could just read the counters here, and they would give you all your totals. And those counters, for example, the top left one might be, well, how many acres is in the farm? Are there any, what animals are on the farm? Do they have hay? What are they growing? Is it hay? Is it wheat? Is it corn? Is it, so all those kind of statistics. Remember in the 1890s, most of America was rural. Well over 70% of Americans lived on farms. And so it was a lot of work to get this information. But nonetheless, using Herman Hollerith's machine here, they completed the census in 3 years. So that was actually a real moneymaker for Herman Hollerith, who went around and sold this machine to national governments around the world, because they also needed to do censuses. Now, the problem is, of course, that when you make a census machine, your customer only shows up once every 10 years. So it's kind of hard to make a decent business of it, even accounting for the fact that different governments have different take the census in different years and so on. There might be some overlap and stuff. But the real problem, the real break for Herman Hollerith came when a company called Counting, Tabulating, and Recording Company, CTR, bought all his patents in 1911 and began making office equipment based on his Hollerith cards. That company, CTR, changed its name in 1924 to IBM. So the roots of IBM go right back to this one device, which we have in our collection. This is actually a replica from, that's an exact replica of the 1890 Hollerith census machine. And that's where IBM comes from. One of my favorite objects in the collection is Enigma. Let's have a close look at it. Most of you probably know about this from now, just from out of personal interest, or even the Hollywood movie, The Imitation Game, for example, which was came out a few years ago. Enigma is basically a flashlight circuit. It's a battery, a lamp, and a switch. But the connection between the switch and the lamp is scrambled by the three wheels you see on top and the plug board you see in the front, such that no letter will scramble to itself. So if you push the H key, the H light will never light up. So what will typically happen is you'll hit, let's say, the H key, and the U key will light up. And so what it's doing is it's scrambling every letter that you type. There's a person beside you to run these machines, usually a 2-man, even a 3-man operation. They're soldiers. And one person to operate the Enigma machine, another one to write down what message is coming in off Enigma, whether it's being transmitted or received. And then how is it being transmitted or received? By Morse code. So there's a Morse code operator as well. It's a 3-man setup. In terms of impact on human history, it's hard to argue that this one object, out of all the objects we have in our collection at the Computer History Museum, had as much impact on human history as this Enigma machine. And I can talk more about that later if you want, but we'll just keep going for now. So it's one of my favorites. It's also one of the simplest. A lot of people don't even think, well, why do you have it in a computer museum? It's not really a computer. And the fact is that some of the earliest computers that were ever made were made to decrypt Enigma messages. So this is the motivation for creating basically the earliest computers. And so that's why we have it in the story. Here's a use of Enigma in the field. You can see the 3 guys. One guy is on the Enigma machine, the other guy, probably a supervisor, either writing things down or just dictating the message, perhaps, more likely. And then there's another guy there writing the message down, and he's going to send it by Morse code as well. Now, one of the more interesting objects, well, we have many interesting objects, but are really, just in terms of scale, one of the more interesting objects we have is a machine called SAGE, the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. If you picture the North American airspace in the 1950s and 60s, this is how it was divided. And it was basically divided into radar sectors, that is, areas which radar towers and radar systems could scan the airspace to see if anything was in the airspace in that sector. So each one of those squares is called a sector. And so at the time, there was a great fear that, and at the time that I'm talking about here is the late 50s, early 60s, the time, a great fear that Soviet bombers would be coming in over Greenland and dropping atomic bombs on New York City and Washington. That was the scenario. And they would be delivered by bombers. There were no missiles yet. And so the threat that SAGE was designed to counter was, in fact, incoming Soviet bombers, relatively slow moving. And but it was the largest computer system in the world when it was built, and cost more than the Manhattan Project. So each one of these sectors had separate radar computer systems. They're all tied together. And there was one big room in Colorado Springs in Cheyenne Mountain where all of the SAGE information was displayed. And you've probably seen that in movies, that giant blue screen or black screen. Maybe even like in Dr. Strangelove, they have some images of that. And so SAGE was built by IBM for the United States Air Force from 1958 to 1965. And IBM made over $1 billion, that's in 1960, just in profit from SAGE. many of the programmers in the United States at the time, some 60%, 60% of the known programmers at the time, there weren't that many, there's, low thousands, worked on Sage at the time. So Sage, was like a pond, a stone thrown in a pond in many ways, like not just technically, but in terms of the forming the discipline of computer science and training a generation of people in real-time computing techniques. So Sage did that, and you never hear about it. It's almost unheard of, and yet it was, like I say, it cost more than the Manhattan Project. So it's quite amazing. Somebody should write a good book on that. The canonical, here we go. Yeah, this is a better picture. The canonical mainframe computer, if you think of the history of computing roughly in terms of technology generations, there's the early vacuum tube computers in the 1950s, and then transistor computers in the 60s, and then integrated circuit computers in the 70s. IBM, interestingly, had their own weird little transitional technology called SLT, which is not quite an integrated circuit, but it was something like an integrated circuit that they could build in huge quantities. The IBM 360, when it came out, it was announced April 7th, 1964. It was a family of 5 different CPUs spanning a 40-to-1 performance range. The reason this is significant is because at the time, when you bought a computer, you had to write all the software yourself, including the operating system. So just imagine that, having to do that now. And so every time a company changed its computer, it would have to throw out all its software and start again. Well, the idea behind 360 was that, hey, we've got a series of computers, a family of computers that span a big performance range, like 40-to-1. So like from a mom and pop store to a big bank. And guess what? They all run the same software. So software compatibility was one of the key selling features of the IBM System 360. IBM made over $100 billion in revenue from 360, and it remains probably the most successful computer architecture of all time. Current Z series mainframes from IBM can still run 360 code. That's how well it was architected. And here it is on display in our, I think it's not a great picture. This is a better picture there. So one of the other cool things we have from IBM, this one comes from just down the road from us, from in San Jose, where in 1956, a team led by Ray Johnson, who was a school teacher turned engineer, developed the world's first disk drive. And this is what you're seeing here. This is literally the first disk drive ever made. And what you're looking at is essentially a series of 24 platters, like sort of dinner plate size, 24 inches across, so bigger than a dinner plate, maybe big dinner plate. And they're coated with magnetic media. They're spinning around, and on the left you see an arm that goes up and down and in and out. So it goes up, I guess you can, yeah, up and down and in and out, and it can access, read and write data to any location in this disk drive and this stack of disks. The whole stack of disks stored 3.75 megabytes. Now you might say, well, that's very small. That's like less than an MP3, but that's applying today's standards to, an earlier problem that they were trying to solve 60 years ago, which is that this actually stores about 65,000 punch cards. And remember, I said earlier, dating back to Herman Hollerith, the punch card was really the dominant input, the dominant I/O mechanism for computers throughout most of the 20th century. So if you could replace a punch card, when you had to find something with a punch card, you had to search through them sequentially. The beauty of the RAMAC was that it was random access. That's why the RA and RAMAC, random access, so that you could actually find information immediately without having to sort through everything before it. So IBM basically came up with the basic blueprint for the modern hard disk drive, and that has not changed since then. Huge improvements in all aspects of the hard disk have occurred, of course, but the basic fundamental idea of a spinning platter with a read-write head that reads and writes information to it is exactly the same. Kind of interesting, actually. We have 50-year-old customer data still on this disk. We can read it because, as you know, a hard disk is non-volatile, right? It keeps the information on it even if you turn the power off. So there's still information on there from 50 years ago. It's pretty cool. Nobody erased it. Okay, this is one of my favorites, the Cray 1 supercomputer. When it came out in 1976, and for the next 5 years, it was the fastest computer in the world. Seymour Cray was a legendary American computer engineer who had built a reputation of building the fastest computers possible at any time. That was his goal, and that's what he was known for. Cost was not a factor in his machines. All his customers had very large budgets, and the Cray 1 that you see here, excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink. The Cray 1 that you see here had three basic customers, three basic uses. One was in weather forecasting, the other was in atomic bomb design, and then the third was in cryptography. Sorry, one more time. And the amazing thing about the Cray 1 computer, actually, among many other things, is that it comes in a circular shape, which spells the letter C for Cray. But it's actually, there's an electrical engineering reason for that too, which is that it keeps the length of the wires interconnecting parts of the machine together shorter. If you compare the machine in a circle, sort of, like this, versus if it was all spread out like that. You can see why Seymour Cray chose a circular arrangement for a supercomputer. So, this was the look of supercomputing. Here's a better picture of it with Seymour Cray standing beside it proudly. And he literally said, my machines cost a lot. This was $10 million in 1976, about 40 million now. He said, my customers are spending a lot of money on my machines. I want them to look the part. Basically, they should look kind of ominous and, powerful. And so he came up with these, you can look at that. It looks very unusual and kind of powerful. And of course, they made a lot of noise as well, which kind of gave it a sense of power. The seats around the main columns here are actually there on purpose, and they're there to cover the power supplies, which are underneath, but also to give, just a place for people to sit. And especially the technicians who would work on this system. So the Cray 1 costs about $100,000 a month to operate between the electricity and the air conditioning. The irony of these big old-time supercomputers is that you put in massive amounts of electricity, which generates heat, which then has to be removed. So it's not the most efficient process in terms of energy use. So nonetheless, amazing things were done on the Cray 1, and they were followed by a Cray 2 and a Cray 3, machines which just got faster and faster, and which more and more expensive, and which just cemented Seymour Cray's reputation as we call him the Mozart of MIPS, the guy who could just make the fastest computer at any one time, no matter what. So here's one of my favorites. This is a picture of Gordon Moore standing in our gallery about Moore's Law. And Moore's Law, for those who don't know, began in an article that Gordon Moore wrote in 1965 for Electronics magazine. And you can see it there under the thing that says Moore's Law. The number of transistors incorporated in a chip will double approximately 24 months. So actually, that's the second version of Moore's Law. The first version said 18 months, so it slowed down a bit. But nonetheless, if you look at the graph behind him, you can see around 2005, all of a sudden the graph, the knee in the graph just takes off. It goes asymptotic almost, you know, just like all exponentials. And so, you know, within about 5 years, we went, as you may recall, we went from having, you know, millions of transistors to billions of transistors on a chip. And that happened really quickly. So this is one of my favorite pictures, because we've got the man himself in front of his eponymous law. And, you know, it was quite a rare occasion that he drops by. So that was fun. Our next machine, our next machine is the Xerox PARC Alto, which was another groundbreaking machine. All of these machines that I'm showing you are really ahead of their time. And, you know, I like to think about what William Gibson, the science fiction writer, once said about, you know, technology. He said, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And, you know, I love that, because you can see it in the history of technology and the history of computing, that there are these outposts of technological advance where people are kind of working on their own, and they're way ahead of the curve. They're way ahead of everybody else, but they're not, but no one really knows about them yet. So Xerox PARC, even though Xerox is a huge company and so on, they did not really commercialize this product very well. That was left to Steve Jobs and then ultimately Bill Gates to draw on what the Xerox PARC invented, which was a graphical user interface, a menu, you know, it had a mouse, it was a menu based, it had a laser printer, it had personal storage, it had a little Diablo disk pack, you could take your programs with you, or the WYSIWYG graphics, you know, what you saw on the screen is what the laser printer printed out. And this is 1972. So the Mac is still 12 years away. And the Xerox PARC is essentially doing basically everything the Mac does. And Windows would be even further away. So, so the Xerox PARC Alto stands as one of those really incredibly important machines. Like, I don't know how to compare it, almost to like Stephenson's rocket. I don't know if there are any steam engines fans, but that was like the first working steam engine. So it's kind of the same thing. Anyway, here's a fun one. This is the Apple I computer. This is the first computer that the two Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs came up with. And we've got ours on the right there. You can see it's signed by Wozniak. And when it first came out in '76, they made about 200 of them, and you could buy it as a blank board and a bag of parts that you could put together yourself if you're handy with soldering iron, or you could buy them pre-assembled and already made. Basically, you added a keyboard, a power supply, and a TV. So it used your TV set to display the images, to display, its output. And so it wasn't a very powerful computer. It did have a built-in BASIC interpreter, so you could write some simple basic programs. But obviously at this time, and you can just tell from the number of chips on the board, that there wasn't a lot of memory. And so it was fairly limited in that sense. Nonetheless, what it did was show to the two Steves that there was a market for these computers, and that what if they made a computer that was actually for the general public rather than for their friends, you know, their hobbyist friends who like soldering and doing stuff like that. So they came up with the Apple II, which I guess I didn't bring, I didn't include, but most of you probably know the Apple II came out in 1977, along with the Commodore PET and the TRS-80. That was a big year for personal computers. And then the IBM PC came out in '81. So basically, the Apple I that you see here, now there were other single board computers, so we don't want to say, you know, this is the first or anything, because it was not, but it was probably the most important single board computer of its time. And it got combined with the Apple II, it led to the Apple II, which is really what kept Apple afloat for the next decade and a half. There were times, for example, when the Macintosh was not selling very well, and it was only sales of the, relatively ancient Apple II that were still going on that kept the company afloat. So Apple I, Apple II, really important to the Apple history. And that was when Apple was called Apple Computer, by the way, which is now it's just called Apple. So, all right. Winding up the tour here. This is a Google server rack, what you see on the left there. And basically that's made up of a 7-foot, 19-inch rack with each shelf there. You can see there's about 25 shelves going all the way down. Each of those shelves has 4 PCs, personal computers, on it. And each of those computers is running the PageRank, part of the Google algorithm to give you search results. So this is from 1999, which, Google's been around a while now. And but when they first started, this is what they used. And they essentially went to an electronics store around here, which is called Fry's, which is now gone. But it was kind of like a supermarket for nerds. And you could literally buy computers literally off the shelf, like they were, potato chips or something, and build your own systems. And that's exactly what the Googlers did. They built several of these racks, and kind of interesting to speculate that if you did a Google search in 99 or 2000, maybe even 2001, it might have gone through this very rack. So that's kind of interesting to think about. Just to give you a quick wrap up, that tells you a bit about the collection. COVID actually allowed us to really cement a lot of our internal systems without the pressure of having having to support a working. I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of our systems related to ticketing and commerce and digital marketing and things like that. We needed some breathing space, and COVID provided that. So we're now fully modernized and up to date with great point of sale terminals and all that good stuff everywhere, and a great bookshop, a museum store, and a cafe as well. So with that, we'll sign off, and I just want to extend a lovely, a hearty welcome to everyone here on the talk to please visit us, and please let me know if you're coming, and I'll give you a tour. So that wraps up that's our talk there. Here's, by the way, 4 generations of computers. The programmers from ENIAC, the lady programmers, holding on the left the first generation from ENIAC. You can see how enormous it is with all the vacuum tubes. And then it gets smaller and smaller until the final one on the right is actually made of transistors. So, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dag. That was really, really interesting.
Oh, great. My pleasure.
And I also encourage people to go to meet them, because that's even better in real, when you can see things and you can turn around and see all the details. And when was taken the last picture? In the 60s, when?
You mean with the 4 ladies?
Yes.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, mid 60s, I would say. Yeah.
I'm sure people have questions.
Yeah, feel free to
raise your hand. If we can give you, open your mic, you can. Okay.
Oh, goodness.
Yes, Kim, I will open your mic. Kim, you can speak now.
Hi there. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, my name's Kim Nesbitt. I'm in Ottawa, Canada, Ontario.
Oh, my
And
hometown.
hi,
It's
and
my
thank you.
It's my
But
hometown, by the
no
way, Ottawa.
way, isn't
Yep.
that funny?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, first of all, I'm a copy editor and translator, and I work a lot in tech with authors and academic journals, and I just love it. And I get very sad when I have to work on a Word document. But my dad was a computer programmer way back, and he would have been so happy to see your presentation, where he's still with us today. And he was the one who I remember using those punch cards in the one and only computer science programming course in our high school in the 70s that lasted only 1 year because there was no interest. But so first of all, I just love your background. And second of all, I wanted to say thank you so much for this really amazing presentation. My son can't join, but he's going to watch it later. And we just decided we're going to come and visit on a trip to
Fantastic.
California and have a look, because wow, I know that's just like a tiny tidbit. So wow, we're just both blown away. Thank you so much for sharing all of this.
Oh, thank you, Kim. That means a lot to me. And please tell me when you're coming so we can give you a nice, give you a good tour and maybe have a coffee or something.
That'd be awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, love to.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Murray, you can now talk.
Two quick questions. Do you happen to have a UNIVAC 1 in your museum?
We have a console from the UNIVAC 1.
Okay.
And a Uniservo, 2 Uniservos. We have Press Eckert's UNIVAC badge, his original UNIVAC badge, the employee badge.
You don't have the memory bank?
Actually, we do. Yes, we have 3 Mercury delay line tanks.
Okay. The amazing thing about those was that you could actually walk through the memory section and see the columns where the memory was stored. My second question is more serious. What attempts does the museum make to represent the software side of computer history, aside from the punch cards?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the second, I had to make a choice because of the 45-minute limit of, we have a whole other exhibit called Make Software Change the World, which is, answers your question. And the fact is, if you read the labels in Revolution, the exhibit we just looked at as you go, there's plenty of software in there, but people did say essentially what you're echoing, which is like, well, software needs its own exhibit, it's its own thing. And I said, yeah, well, we get it. So we did that. It's been open for 5 years. It's based on 7 different software stories: Photoshop, texting, car crash, MRI, World of Warcraft, and Wikipedia. And it tells the story of how each of those was developed. And our 3 guidelines are really history, impact, technology. We try to touch on each of those 3 aspects of those programs, because the way to, for many years, curators and museum people have sort of done a lot of pro clutching about like, how do we display software? There's nothing to it. I said, well, we figured the way out is just to show the application. Obviously no one just wants to look at a box or, like source code. That is even worse, really. For the general public, don't get me wrong, it's very attractive for those who like it, but so we said, to tell the story of software, tell the story of people, essentially, and how it affects people.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Dewey as a
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
I can hear you.
Hi, very interesting presentation, and I'll just mention that I used to live in the Deep River, Chalk River area near Ottawa.
Nice.
Anyway, I was just wondering, in terms of like electronic handheld devices, everybody has a cell phone, smartphone these days. I still use an HP 41CX that I bought in 1990. So in terms of like advanced handheld calculators, let's say, what's the earliest item that's in your museum's collection?
Well, handheld calculators?
Yeah, so the
yeah.
HP 41CX that I have, the 41 series, I think first came out around 1970, and then it was discontinued in 1990. So I bought it right after it was discontinued. It's about 1 inch thick,
yeah,
but still fits in the palm, and it uses reverse Polish notation. I think for scientists and engineers, this was really, I think the main step in going away from slide rules, right?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, well, I think we've got it. I don't want to say we have all HP calculators because that's pretty grandiose, but we've got a awful lot of them, like hundreds of them, probably. And some of those are duplicates, including, red dot HP 35s, which are, and oral histories with the creator of the HP 35. But I appreciate that you brought up the slide rule, because as you know, when the HP 35 was sold, what was it called? An electronic slide rule. They didn't call them calculators. So yeah, that's a cool story. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I actually first used a 41, I think maybe around 1981 or so, and first learned programming on that.
Oh yeah. Does it have the little magnetic cards on the side?
I don't have the card reader, but
yeah.
it does work with a card reader. It's a little magnetic strip that's maybe about 1 centimeter wide.
Right.
What was it, 2.5, 3 inches long? I forget.
Mm-hmm.
It had its own. You could also get a little printer that you could use. So it uses like thermal print paper.
Yeah.
And you could print out your source code. Yeah.
Yes, I remember. That's right. Good one. Well, good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And maybe as the last question, we can take the one from Barbara in the Q&A. You can open the Q&A by clicking the button.
Okay. Oh my gosh. So, do you want me to type the answer?
You can read the question, please. Yes.
Oh, read the question? Okay. Another do you have question. IBM 7070. I was a gopher and computer operator on a 7070 at the Brown Computer Center after I graduated. My husband and I were members of the Computer Museum in Marlborough. Thank you. And helped pack it up when it was moving to Boston. I packed Napier's bones. Oh, Barbara, I'd love to talk to you more. Is she still there? Let me type an answer. That's great. I don't know if she's on the, anyway. I'll just say we don't have an IBM, I'll answer her question. We do not have an IBM 7070. We do, however, have a complete 7030, the stretch machine, which is an even more spectacular machine. It takes up about 3,000 square feet, 300 square meters of space. And I guess we'll just leave it at that. Yeah. IBM mainframes are, generally speaking, a big commitment for a company. You had to plan a space, special room, special electricity, special air conditioning, access control. They didn't just let anybody in the computer room. And so sometimes you could spend, if the computer was $1 million, you could spend $500,000 on it, on just getting the room prepared and getting facilities. Yeah. It's a big, yeah. Anyway.
We are running a bit out of time, so we'll need to stop the question. That's a pity, because I also had a question, but I will send you an email on.
Okay. Yeah.
So thank you again for this really nice tour of the early computing history.
My pleasure. Yeah. Anytime.
And I again encourage everyone to go when they have the opportunity to go to the museum.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Dag.
Okay. Have a good day, you guys.
You too.
Bye-bye.